Good morning, and welcome to this BSI webinar titled Getting Ready to Deal with Data Subject Access Requests, commonly known as DSARs. With me today on the panel is Sean Crowley, and Sean is the Manager for Cybersecurity and Information Resilience at BSI. Sean knows a tremendous amount about information privacy, risk, and governance in business, being in the position he has over the last 9 years, working in a variety of roles, including data protection, privacy, electronic discovery, information security, information and systems administration. He's here today to bring you some of what he knows firsthand from working in security and governance management, and he understands information security risk from external professional services as well as from the internal client perspective. He's also a big sports fan of a little-known team called Man U, and unfortunately his ability to watch and to a lesser extent participate in their support is being hampered by all of this GDPR and DSAR stuff. Anyway, I digress. My name is Robert Lee, and I'm here to help facilitate the webinar between you, the audience, and Sean.
Thanks for that, Rob. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar today. As Rob was saying, my name is Sean Crowley, and I'm a manager here at BSI Cybersecurity and Information Resilience. And obviously, the topic of discussion today is going to be data subject access requests, what they are and how to deal with them, and whether or not, I suppose, you think they're going to be a problem coming into the latter part of the year and certainly after May of this year. So in terms of just a quick overview of BSI for those of you who are new and haven't been to any of these webinars before. So cybersecurity and information resilience, effectively what we do, we enable organizations to secure information for cybersecurity threats, strengthening their information governance, and in turn assuring resilience, mitigating risks while safeguarding them against vulnerabilities in their critical infrastructure. So some of the main areas that we look at, cybersecurity, so penetration testing, vulnerability management, incident response, cloud security services, security awareness training, so phishing and end user awareness training, software as a service solutions, social engineering and simulation testing, compliance and other types of testing. So for those of you who need PCI compliance, we offer PCI DSS services. We also have a number of QSAs here. There's also cyber lab testing. But the one probably people are here for today is the one down the bottom left-hand corner, so data management and privacy. So we do offer kind of full stack GDPR services, information lifecycle management, and e-discovery and forensics. So for the path to GDPR, for those of you who haven't been on these webinars before, and I'm sure some of you have come back to a few of them, we kind of started these back in July 2017, sort of in the run-up to the GDPR, to start informing clients and other individuals who are interested in the GDPR and what it was. We've covered a range of topics: pen testing, security awareness training, incident response, there was an information resilience series event held in Manchester back in October. In November, we had the GDPR Achieving Compliance, which was a step-by-step methodology for achieving compliance. It was 20 steps, I believe. My colleague, Gavin Dalton, gave that talk. If anyone is interested, I believe it's still up on the BSI website. The last one we did, my colleague Stephen Scott gave, was the GDPR, the role of the DPO, and whether or not your organization actually requires a DPO, what their responsibilities are. So today we're looking at dealing with data subject access requests. So is your organization ready to deal with them? We're going to go into some practical guidance on how to spot them, what to do when they come in, how to handle them if you need, or how to handle the supervisory authority if it gets escalated to investigations, etc. And then in February, we're going to be running one on privacy impact assessments. So in terms of our compliance professional services, as I sort of mentioned earlier, and I won't go into too much detail because it's been on a number of the courses already, we do offer GDPR Foundation training, scoping workshops, gap analysis and implementation support for organizations who are working towards compliance with the GDPR and the new regulations. And then we also do compliance validation once the implementation has been completed, and ongoing support, so continuous assessment and audits. So into the good stuff. The webinar today will hopefully give you some insight into the following. So I'm going to discuss what the GDPR is in 1 minute. We have discussed this at length in a number of the other webinars for those who are interested. So today I'm going to try and focus specifically on data subject access requests. We're going to look at what is a data subject access request and why should you care about it. What does a data subject access request look like and how can you recognize it? Responding to a data subject access request. So what is the acceptable standard for doing so, how to do it properly. There'll also be some war/horror stories of responses that have gone wrong. Operationalizing the data subject access request response. So what your organization should be looking to do to handle these in the most efficient manner, because ultimately, if there is a lack of a process in place and come May next year, it could end up getting expensive trying to handle these if you end up getting a lot of them. And then we're going to have a quick wrap up just on what we've learned. So what is the GDPR in 1 minute? So effectively, the GDPR aims to protect the personal data of EU citizens. It puts individuals back in control of their personal data. It applies to all EU member states, so any organisation who operates within the EU market or who holds information on EU data subjects. And when we say EU data subjects, we're talking about EU citizens. There's going to be a requirement to report a data breach involving personal data to your local supervisory authority, whoever that may be, within 72 hours of becoming aware of it. There will be fines of up to 20 million euro or 4% of your annual worldwide turnover for serious breaches of non-compliance. May 25th, 2018 is the day that everyone needs to watch out for, because that's the day it's going to become live and it's going to be enforceable. There will be a mandatory data protection officer requirement for some organizations. And if you want to find out what organizations are going to require a DPO, the previous talk that my colleague Stephen Scott gave last month is probably a good place to have a look for more information there. And there'll be no opt-out for the UK with Brexit. So the UK have already said that they're going to comply with the GDPR, which effectively they would have to do anyway if they want to continue to trade data within the EU market. So what is a data subject access request and why should you really care about it? So the definition, I suppose, is a data subject access request is the right of an individual to request any personal data that an organization holds on them. This right is a principle of the current EU directive, the 9546 EC, and it's retained within the new GDPR. It is designed to regulate the processing of information from which a living individual can be identified or singled out, either from the information on its own or when combined with other information. So context is always going to be very important in deciding what personal data is, and every organization realistically is going to be different depending on the types of information that they're collecting. So what it means for individuals like you and me. So it means a couple of different things when it comes to access rights in the new regulation, and these include that there's more information out there for people regarding their rights. So I sit on a committee for ISACA Ireland, which is the Information Security or Information Systems Audit and Controls Association, and we've run a lot of GDPR events over the last probably year or so. And it's the first time I've really noticed that we're almost getting as many members from the general public coming to some of the seminars as we are people that we would normally expect from industry. So there is a lot of, I guess, information out there for people. People are getting more educated on this particular subject because, you know, they've heard, obviously there's probably financial benefit in them, or in it for them, if organizations are mishandling their personal data. Obtaining copies of personal data will be easier for individuals. So the GDPR has brought in a number of aspects regarding data portability. They've also reduced the amount of time organizations have to comply with the regulations. And obviously, the fines as well are something that work for in hand with the individuals. That organizations are, you know, really going to be under pressure to start dealing with these requests properly and efficiently. And as we mentioned there, obtaining a copy of the personal information is going to be faster. So currently, for example, in Ireland, and I think the UK as well, you have about 40 days to fully comply with a data subject access request, unless you've asked for an extension. Under the GDPR, they're reducing that time period from 40 days down to 1 month. So what does it mean for businesses? No fees will be able to be charged to process data subject access requests. So currently, in the UK, you're able to charge a nominal fee of about £10 sterling the last time I checked, and in Ireland it's €6.35. You'd probably be surprised at the amount of people that puts off currently in terms of following through with a data subject access request once they're asked to pay for it, because it's not necessarily that easy in terms of you can't go online normally and pay with a credit card. It has to be a postal order or a check, which a lot of people don't have checkbooks anymore. But that particular avenue is going to be taken away come May 25th, and you will have to, or organizations will have to respond to them free of charge. Data minimization will no longer be a nice to have feature, if it ever was. And what we mean by data minimization is only holding the data that you actually need. It's gotten much easier over the last number of years to store vast quantities of data. Big data is obviously a huge thing in the marketplace at the moment. As storage gets cheaper, you know, it just becomes easier to collect troves and troves of information on individuals. However, doing that going forward is going to add to the complexity of the compliance process. And finally, as we mentioned, the request will have to be responded to within 1 month. So it's kind of reducing it by about 10 days in most cases at the moment. And even 40 days currently from customers that I've dealt with is quite difficult to manage for some organizations. Processes and procedures for dealing with data subject access requests will also have to be developed. So this is something that you don't want to have to start from scratch every time. You do want to have a workflow there to make sure that the process is consistent each time you do it, because it could get you in trouble. For example, if there's ever a complaint made because for one particular request you checked, you know, system A, B, and C, and for another request you've done D, E, and F. That will obviously raise flags with a supervisory authority or a data protection commissioner, who may look to investigate your organization if they receive too many of these requests. So some supervisory authority statistics from 2016. So I've taken this from the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner over here in Ireland. So you can see there we've access rights, disclosure, complaints, security, accuracy, and direct marketing. So access rights, or the number of complaints received regarding access rights, were considerably higher than any of the other areas. This probably goes to show over the last number of years that people are becoming more aware when you look at that, it's over 4 times as many complaints regarding data subject access requests as any other area that is mentioned from the annual report. So Rob, I think we'll go to the first poll there for people.
Thank you very much, Sean. Yes, absolutely. So our first poll here is about DSARs, and it's about how many data subject access requests has your organization, did it have to respond to last year? And do let us know, so just so that we have a little bit more of an understanding of exactly what's happening right now in your particular industry. So let us know if it's none, if it's 1 to 50, if it's 51 to 100, if it's 100 plus, or just let us know if you just don't know. So the results of the poll are striking. And bearing in mind that we do have hundreds of people on this webinar call today. The number of you who said 0 is over 50%, it's 52. The number of you who said it's 1 to 50, it's 21%. The number of you who've said 51 to 100 is 1%. And the number of you who've said over 100 data subject access requests you had to process in 2017 is 3%. 23% of you said you didn't know. Those are some very interesting results, wouldn't you say, Sean?
Well, actually, possibly a little bit surprised there that there is probably so many that haven't received any at the moment. But then maybe that's down to user education, and I guess we can see what happens after May next year. One of the ones that was interesting actually was that we have 3% over 100 data subject access requests on an annual basis, which is, reasonably significant, I would say. So, for example, I have one customer that receives about 3,000 per year, which is a lot to deal with, but then they obviously have a kind of very stringent process in place to be able to manage that many. So as we go through, I suppose, the rest of the slide deck, it'll be interesting to see, especially the 52% who haven't had to deal with them before, what their opinions are in the next couple of polls, to see if they're worried, I suppose, about an influx of these requests, and perhaps some of the further information that we're going to be giving about how to operationalize it to make it easier for those organizations to manage going forward. So what does a data subject access request look like? So you can see probably on the little letter there at the side of the screen, we need to really realistically consider a couple of things when discussing data subject access requests and what they are. So the first thing is, who is submitting the request? What is their motivation? What is their level of knowledge about the regulation? So this is going to be very important, and we're going to discuss this a bit more in the next couple of slides. There's going to be a big difference between someone who is in tune with their privacy rights under the GDPR and someone that isn't. And we call the two types of requests in this instance either boilerplate requests or weaponized requests. And weaponized requests, I'm not sure if it was coined by my colleague Gavin Dalton before, but certainly we're going to go into an example of what these look like in the next couple of slides. So actually you can see just in the letter I have at the side, that would be the example of what I would consider to be general boilerplate stuff, copied and pasted from the Data Protection Commissioner's website, and not too much extra information on it there. So a typical boilerplate data subject access request will generally consist of the following and look like this. So for those of you who know what that is, it's a T1000 from the film Terminator, and luckily not all subject access requests will look exactly like that, because you wouldn't want that arriving on your doorstep. However, the point I'm trying to get across here is that the boilerplate ones come off an assembly line. They all look the same, give or take, with some very minor or subtle differences, but effectively they're templated, so they're taken from the Information Commissioner's website or the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, or depending on what country you're in, whoever the supervisory authority is. Generally, what they'll say is a statement to say that it is in fact a subject access request. So if we remember the image we had on the previous slide, it will say, I wish to submit the subject access request under whatever the specific section of the Act was. So it will also detail hopefully information that will assist the organisation to find that individual's personal information. So they won't always contain that. But certainly any subject access request that I would submit, I would give some level of detail to assist the organisation in helping them find, I guess, my personal information. And that could be generally my email address and my name. It could be as simple as that. Normally for direct marketing ones, that's what you're going to give because they've contacted you via the email address. If you're an employee in an organization, you might look for things like your HR files. You might look for meetings of minutes, for example. If it was part of a disciplinary case, there's plenty of examples there. And that's about as straightforward as the process is going to get. So I did mention a weaponized request, and we're going to have a look at exactly what one of those is. So this is one I sent recently enough, back towards the start of, well, about the middle of January there. So if we have a quick look down through this, we can see what it says. So I've obviously redacted the information of the person that I sent it to. I've informed them that I'm to be provided with the following information under the European data protection laws that I'm legally entitled to. And if we have a look down through what I'm requesting here, so where, how, and whom you've obtained the contact details, where and how consent to send marketing information to the contact details was obtained, details of all usages of my data on a purpose-by-purpose basis, any privacy notices employed at the time the data was collected, detailing and providing a full copy of the data set relating to myself that you currently hold, to include at least the following. So data in the database, data and any backups of that database, so taped media, mirrored databases, any physical hard copies of the data, any unstructured data, Excel or Word documents, where data is stored and who can access it, in particular if it crosses international borders, so outside of the European Union. How the data is secured, whether at rest or in transit. Is it encrypted at rest or in transit? How long it will be retained for? And how all traces of the data will be securely destroyed. So, and just at the bottom of it as well, I've also asked for a copy of the data protection policy, and I've also just put in a reminder that it was submitted on the 12th of the 1st, and as is required by law, I should have a response by the 21st of the 2nd. Now, this is a very harsh subject access request, I suppose, to send out, and I should say, in terms of full disclosure, it is not meant as a way of trying to monetize it, particularly from myself. Generally, it's to open discussion with the organization, because I just want to find out how they've got my details. We're going to discuss this as part of the response later on, engaging with the individual, because generally I would normally be quite happy if they answered the top 2 questions there. Sometimes they won't reply. So this particular one, I haven't actually got a response yet. So to respond quickly is important, to engage with the individual, because there is always a good chance that all they're trying to do is ascertain where the details have been obtained. So, surely you can charge something for that, you would think. So, as I mentioned on an earlier slide, come the 25th of May, an organisation must provide a copy of the relevant information to the data subject free of charge. unless the organization can prove that the request is manifestly unfounded or excessive. Now, if you went back to that previous response, or that previous subject access request on the other slide, there is nothing there that necessarily says it's manifestly unfounded or excessive. Generally, what they're talking about when they talk about excessive is not the amount of information that you want. It's more that if you are submitting a subject access request to the organization on a monthly basis, that's sometimes when you can get pushback, because you can say, we provided this information last month and the month before, and this is the third subject access request we've got. You could defend not going back again, because there are going to be some people out there who are just there to pester the organizations. However, proving this is often much easier said than done in reality, and the onus is on the organization to be able to prove it. So can we jump over to poll 2, Rob?
Absolutely. That's some very interesting information you had there, Sean. I'm now just going to launch the next poll, which is, has your organization ever received a complaint regarding the handling of a data subject access request? So let us know if you've ever received a complaint regarding the handling of a DSAR. Either yes, no, or let us know if you don't know. So the results in the answers for the question, has your organization ever received a complaint regarding the handling of a data subject access request? 6% of you said yes, 68% of you said no, and 26% of you said, I don't know. Any thoughts on those numbers, Sean?
That is quite good, actually. I would say that only 6% of the I suppose
hundreds
people that are on the webinar today, of the hundreds of people have received complaints, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your organization has done anything wrong. Again, it could be just that the process wasn't particularly defined, or you could have got a very difficult data subject to have to deal with. There is circumstances around when complaints are made, I guess, and they tend to a lot of the time be from, say, employees or ex-employees of organizations. But I suppose it's good to know that 68% of organizations, maybe going back to the first poll, I'm sure a lot of those, certainly the ones that, we're in the higher end of the spectrum there, 50 to 100 or over 100, likely have had one or two, I would say, but the process is probably mature enough at this stage that there isn't too many coming in anymore. So that's quite interesting results there. Are you happy enough for me to kick off back into the slides, Rob?
Absolutely, go for it.
So, how do you respond to a subject access request? So there's a couple of rules here. The first rule, be polite. So just remember, anything you say can be used against you in a subject access request. So I had a slide in the deck that I've given at other presentations to show examples of the bad responses that I've got to subject access requests from people. I didn't particularly put it into this one because some of them have told me to go away in less than polite terms. And the only thing I suppose you need to remember about that, and it's important for training of staff and organizations and things like that, is that information is then part of the data subject access request and could, effectively have to be given out to them. We're going to discuss this a bit later on, but keeping it as professional, keeping a subject access request response as professional as you would any other customer correspondence is extremely important. So identify the individual. So you don't have to supply any information until you have identified the individual. This is very important because it also protects their rights and freedoms, so that I just don't submit a subject access request from, garbage123@yahoo.com pretending I'm Sean Crowley. It is up to the organization to fully be able to identify them. And it's also a good way of reducing the time on the clock. So remember, we said it's the time to respond is reducing to 1 month. You don't have to start the clock until you've actually reasonably identified the individual. So this can include obtaining reasonable assurance that they are who they claim to be. So copies of passports, a copy of a driver's license, for example. And this is obviously to protect their rights and freedoms. So are you charging a fee? So there's still scope at the moment to charge a nominal fee in some countries under the current directive. So we've got £10 in the UK, €6.35, for example, in the Republic of Ireland, where I am today. This deterrent will be removed in the new regulation. And it's important to note that it is currently a deterrent because it's just awkward to have to get a response to say, yes, we will process this, but I require €6.35 to do it, because then the person has to go to a local post office or a bank to get a postal order or whatever it is to submit it in if they don't have a checkbook handy. Rule 4, do you have the individual's information? So things to remember here. We talked earlier about big data, but if you don't have their personal information, you don't have to search and produce it. So that's obviously a very important thing here. Data minimization is going to be very important for businesses going forward. The GDPR is really going to probably press home to organizations that, it's not worth just holding information anymore for the sake of holding it. There is opportunities there for organizations, because it does mean that the information that you do hold in the end will actually be relevant and probably more valuable to your organization, which could ultimately save costs down the line. Data retention and destruction policies will need to be adhered to. So if you're holding it, it's producible to the individual. It doesn't necessarily matter how long it goes back for, as long as you have it there. Is the information dynamic? So what we mean by this is that you can still make routine changes to the data after getting a request. So this means amendments and deletions, which is important to note. It doesn't mean all processing necessarily has to stop if it's part of a business as usual process. However, such changes should only be part of routine business practices. So something that happens on an ongoing basis, whether it's amendments to account information, for example, that's part of a, daily database checks and things like that. It is not an excuse to remove embarrassing information. So I've seen countless examples where organizations have been corresponding with each other internally, for example, about particular data subjects who've submitted requests where they have said less than complimentary things about the individual. That individual is then entitled to that information because it is personal data about them. So the golden rule, or the rule of thumb here, is that if you wouldn't write it on a postcard, don't write it in an email. Rule 6, other people have the right to privacy too. So some of the things to remember here: you do not have to give out information belonging to other individuals as part of a request. However, it doesn't mean that you can blanketly refuse to release all information. Redaction is obviously one option, or consent from the other individuals is another option. So for example, if you consider an email from one employee to another that was about a particular data subject, those emails, because they're about that other data subject, even though it's the two specific employees communicating about it and the person isn't involved, but they're maybe the subject of the email, that person is entitled to that particular email. However, unless you have the consent from those other two individuals to produce it and send it out, you don't have to, they have the right to privacy too. So you may have to look at that, perhaps redact the information that's in it, black out their email addresses and their names, then it can be produced and given to the individual. Now this sounds like, it's good obviously for the other person in the organization that, their information isn't exposed, but it can be quite a pain for some organizations to do. So I've seen subject access requests that have come in where there is stacks and stacks of email, and someone is sitting there with a box of Tipp-Ex pens scoring out other people's personal details. That is a very manual approach to it. There's also technical solutions that can help in that redaction process as well. So do any exemptions apply? So this is also going to be an important one. You don't have to give out information if it falls under an exemption. So if you look under the GDPR or the local data protection legislation, you will see examples where information doesn't have to be given out. So confidential references. For example, if an ex-employee of mine is, looking for another job, and their new potential employer asks me for a reference, and the reference that I give is a bad reference, if that employee comes back to me with a subject access request, I don't necessarily have to produce it because it was confidential between my company and the other company. Intellectual property is also something that is exempt, so you don't have to give out information if it's going to expose IP. Legal advice that you have received regarding an ongoing court case or something that could jeopardize a court case, you don't have to give personal information out regarding that legal advice. Crime and taxation. So there was a case over here in Ireland a number of years ago where a local criminal who was involved in the drugs trade submitted a subject access request to our national police force to try and get information that they had on him. He was probably looking for where they were surveilling him from, if they had any of his premises under CCTV and things like that. That one was thrown out because it's not in the public interest effectively for that kind of information to be given out. Health records as well is something that doesn't have to be given out to individuals unless there has been consent from the doctor that provided the medical information. So if you think organizations that maybe send staff out for health screening and things like that, that kind of stuff is exempt unless the doctor that has given it allows the company to give it out to the individual. So Rule 8, are any complex codes used? So things to remember. If complex codes are used that can identify the individual, these must be produced and explained as part of the response. So what we mean here, if we take, for example, a symbol that is used in a database where the only means of identification is using a key held by the organization. So for example, if you have a list of people that attended a particular training course and you've identified them as team member 1, team member 2, team member 3 on a particular spreadsheet, you need to be able to give that person the information to identify which particular team member they were, for example. And Rule 9, preparing the response. So as we discussed earlier, you only have 1 month from the time you've identified the individual. This is quite a short period of time if you're not prepared. Even 40 days at the moment can be a short time if you're not prepared. And the thing to remember is that the clock is ticking on this. So what happens if I don't respond? So hiding from the issue is never an appropriate way to deal with a subject access request. So sticking your head in the sand won't work. All that's going to happen is that the individual will end up making a complaint to the supervisory authority, and they will likely issue a letter of investigation. And a formal investigation, while not necessarily for the DSAR, could end up with your organization being pulled up in a number of other aspects regarding data privacy that could end up with you getting a fine, whether substantial or not.
So this poll is about how you would rate your organization in terms of attracting data subject access requests. So this is whether or not you would rate how you would rate your organization in terms of getting more and more of these data subject access requests coming in.
Yeah, so I think it's around the risk profile. If you think your organization is a little more risky for getting subject access requests than others.
So do select one, whether you think your organization is going to be high risk, medium risk, low risk, or whether there's no risk. So how would you rate your organization in terms of attracting data subject access requests? 7% of you think that your organization is high risk. 20% of you think that your organization is a medium risk profile. 66% think that your organization is low risk, and 6% of you think that you have no risk. There's some interesting results.
Some interesting results there, yeah, exactly. Once again, so it's interesting to see that there is, well, I suppose 7% of the organizations believe that they're at a higher risk of getting more of these subject access requests. Again, you know, I'd imagine quite a few of those are already the ones that are in that bracket that we discussed earlier, Rob, of over 51 to 100 or over 100 requests on an annual basis.
Absolutely, yeah.
Particular industries as well are probably more susceptible. For example, if you have the ability, or if your organization has the ability to maybe annoy a customer, so if you think of organizations like banks and insurance companies, if they're raising interest rates, they're raising insurance premiums, etc., can possibly be at higher risk sometimes than other organizations. The other interesting figure there, obviously, as well, is that 6% that there's no risk to the data. So that is quite an interesting figure, I suppose, certainly from my own point of view. And, you know, it would be interesting to see exactly what areas those organizations are in. So perhaps there is actually, or they're not processing any EU citizens' data at all, in which case they're probably right that there is no risk of data subject access requests for them. So I think we actually had another poll coming up just after that one, Rob.
Okay, yes, that next poll is there a defined process in place in your organization for dealing with the data subject access requests? So this is whether or not you've got something in your business which systems or processes, etc., for dealing with these when they come through. Let us know if you have such systems and processes, or whether you don't, or whether you don't know if you have any of those in place at the minute. So the results of that poll are 26% of you said yes, there is something in place, 58% of you said no, nothing, and 16% of you are unaware of whether or not you have something in place in your business.
Thanks for that, Rob. Again, probably the figure there, I guess, that stands out is the 58% that don't have anything in place at the moment, which is interesting enough, I suppose. I'd imagine the majority of those, probably from the previous poll, fit into the low risk category versus the no risk category as well. For anyone that fits into the higher medium and there's no process in place, or if you answered that, it's probably time to start looking at putting some formalized process into it. And in the next section of the webinar today, we're going to talk about operationalizing the data subject access request response.
Okay, great. I'll pass the presentation back over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, so operationalizing the data subject access request response, what BSI recommend. So ultimately, a structured approach is going to be needed for this. So a structured approach taking into account the following steps: that you recognize, review, verify, acknowledge or refuse, engage with the individual, plan, find and retrieve the data that you need to retrieve, produce the information, document your activities, and balance the rights of others versus the individual. So when we say the individual, in that last point, we're talking about the data subject who has submitted the request. So we're going to go into more detail on these in the next couple of slides. So recognizing requests, you're going to need to ask yourself these questions. So what does a subject access request look like? What does it sound like? So we showed examples earlier on of subject access requests. either the boilerplate or weaponized. Now, it's important to note that it doesn't necessarily have to say it's a subject access request. All it has to say is that the person is requesting a copy of their personal data. What does it sound like? So under the GDPR, I suppose another aspect of it is if your organization has a social media platform, so whether it's Facebook or Twitter, a subject access request doesn't necessarily have to come in a formal letter or a formal email. It could come in over Twitter. It could come in over Facebook. So your staff are going to need to be able to recognize it. It can also come in over the telephone. If you have call recording in place, for example, it would be a way for a data subject to, I suppose, prove that they submitted it to someone, even though those ones are quite unusual. And even as someone personally who sends out data subject access requests from time to time, I have never done one yet over the phone. So, are staff trying to recognize their access request? When a subject access request has been recognized, what process should the staff enact? Who does it get directed to? And when does it need to be forwarded on? So if you wanted to get kind of smart about it, having something in around your privacy policy on a website, for example, could be a defensible position around this. So giving clear guidance on who they should submit subject access requests to is possibly one of the better ways of defending your organization of one coming in erroneously. So some people would argue with me to say that, well, are we just advertising, for example, that people can do this and we risk the influx of requests? And that is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that if someone sends the request into, accounts payable at acme.com, it might not necessarily get to the person it needs to go to. Whereas at least if you have, DPO at acme.com on your website, the only real emails going to that are privacy related, and it can be picked up easier. Also, if you ended up missing a request because it went to an address or to a person who never actioned it, your defensible position is going to be much better if you can say, well, we actually have a process in place for submitting these and the individual didn't follow that process, and as such we weren't able to action it. However, we are looking at I suppose we're looking at making that process better, or how we can assist data subjects going forward. So the question is how that is done, and effectively a lot of it has got to be training. So training of your staff, anyone that is involved in processing personal data, it's going to be important that they know how to recognize subject access requests. The next step is review. So is it actually a subject access request? So if someone writes into a bank, for example, and says, I would like a copy of my last bank statement, that could be treated as a business as usual request, for example. It's not necessarily a subject access request where they're looking for all their information. Is it a valid subject access request? So has the user actually submitted all the details that they are required to submit? Have you been able to identify them? At the moment, as I said, you can still charge a fee, but that's going to be gone come May 25th. Things to consider: the source of the request, the information requested, is it PII or otherwise? So we say PII, personally identifiable information. If they're not looking for PII, then it's not a subject access request. So important to note those differences. Is it manifestly excessive? So has the same person submitted a subject access request to your organization every month for the last 6 months? Probably time you can start pushing back on those particular requests. And the Data Protection Commissioner, in whatever country it is throughout the EU, will generally look favourably on that if the organisation has assisted, and at a particular time it's looking like the person has a gripe or is causing trouble or trying to cause inconvenience to the organisation. So verification. You can't assume that on every occasion the person making the request is who they say they are. So it is reasonable to require verification before sending information. We talked about the passport or driver's license example earlier on to help try and identify them. It should be considered, however, on a risk prioritized basis. So some of the examples we're going to give here now. An internal HR data request would not require this. So for example, if I submitted a data subject access request to BSI because I wanted my HR file, for example, and it wouldn't necessarily require me to identify myself because I already work here and people know who I am. A request received by email or by post or by Facebook or Twitter would obviously necessitate this because you can't necessarily identify them based on those type of requests if you don't have if you don't know them personally, I guess. So acknowledge or refuse the request. Acknowledge the request as soon as possible. So if we go back to my weaponized one that I showed you there earlier on, where I told the person it had been submitted on the 12th of January, I think it was, and that they had until the 21st of February to respond to it. It is useful to respond to it as soon as possible, because if it's someone like me, for example, I will be quite happy then that they're actually progressing it. And if they have any further questions, that is when I will happily discuss to say, okay, you know what, I actually don't want really all that information. If you can just tell me how you got the information in the first place, I might be happy enough with that, you know. And what they might say is, well, it looks like you signed up to our mailing list on such and such a date. And I may accept that and say, okay, perhaps someone in my family decided to use my email address to get this information and I wasn't aware of it, for example. Manage the requester's expectations is obviously going to be important here as well. And if an extension would be required, so it can go up to 90 days in limited circumstances, this needs to be negotiated at the beginning. So there's no point in waiting till the end of the 30 days and saying, we need another 90 days to do this. Sorry about that. That is just guaranteed to get you a complaint with the relevant supervisory authority. If you're refusing the request, the onus is on the organization to provide a robust justification as to why the request will not be fulfilled. And in the event that the request is rejected by the organization, the requester has the right to escalate to their supervisory authority for mediation. If you reject a subject access request, as in that last example there, you are almost guaranteed, I would say 99% of the time, that they will go to the Data Protection Commissioner or the supervisory authority in that country, and that's because they've submitted that request for a particular reason. They want the information, and they're going to try and make your life difficult, I would guess, to make sure that you're not just trying to fob them off. So engaging with the individual, this could be crucial. Attempt to narrow the focus. So if they haven't given any idea of what they're particularly looking for, so an example of this, I was required when applying for a particular certification that I got that I needed a copy of my university degree transcript of my final year results. The university that I went to were charging €65 for this at the time, so I submitted a subject access request and said that's in particular what I was looking for, and they sent it out to me free of charge. So there is, in a lot of cases, someone will be looking for something in particular. Getting them to narrow the focus is something that organizations can do, and it might help this process as well. So you can't necessarily force them to narrow the scope, but merely provide additional details that will help you find or locate the requested information. So email addresses, telephone numbers, for example, that they might have submitted or might be linked to their details. Clarifying the request. So before responding to the subject access request, you may ask the requester for information you reasonably need to find the personal data covered by the request. If anything that they've put in isn't necessarily easy to understand, you have the right to go back and try and clarify things. And you don't have to comply with the subject access request until you have necessarily received it. So, even if the relevant information is difficult to find and retrieve, it is not acceptable for you to delay responding to the subject access request unless you reasonably require more information to help you find the data in question. So that's something to keep mind of, that if it is fairly self-explanatory, trying to push back on trivial issues will more than likely get you in more trouble than it's worth. So plan, find and retrieve. It's not always a straightforward process, so a project plan may be required. Certainly at the beginning, when you're coming up with this process on where the information is, how you're going to find it. Do you need external tools, for example, to help you do this? The organization must be satisfied that they have identified all potential data sources and data sets before proceeding. We mentioned earlier on, there's no point in managing one data request by going to systems A, B, and C and managing another one with a completely different process on systems D, E, and F, because the consistency is going to be out the window in that particular instance. So ideally, this can be based on pre-existing information registers, data flows, and data classifications. So understanding how data flows through your organization from the point of collection through to where it's stored, how it's used, who you share it with or where it gets transferred to how it's disposed of. So a discovery practice is normally involved and will be required. All data should be collated into a central repository to allow for formal production. So I had an example of a client there last year who told me that they had received 2 subject access requests during the year, and they reckoned that the first one cost them about €50,000 and the second one cost them about €32,000 between all the staff that they had working on it for numerous hours, redacting other people's information out of it. Obviously getting myself in to assist them with the consultancy process and what they actually had to produce. So it's quite expensive, certainly when you don't have a process in place. And finally, produce and deliver. So make sure you leave yourself delivery time. All data identified during the discovery and based on the requesters will have to be formally compiled. It must be presented in an understandable format. So I had a request one particular time where the person was planning on producing it in binary format and giving it to the data subject, so in ones and zeros for the less technical people on the call here today. That is absolutely not acceptable, and you would likely be in a lot of trouble with a supervisory authority if you went down that line of doing that. The data must be produced as a physical or hard copy, or as a soft copy, and this should be agreed with the requester. Generally, if you've received it electronically, you respond electronically, and vice versa. But it's not a guaranteed rule, and this should be really agreed with the data subject in advance. Personal data should be highlighted to where it is in the various documents. Now, in practice, this doesn't really happen, and I haven't necessarily seen it in a lot of cases. I haven't really seen any complaints where personal data hasn't been highlighted either. But realistically, if you go by the letter of the law, that's what should be done. Supply and transfer in a secure manner, or could be considered a breach. So if it's not delivered securely, and the information is intercepted, you may end up with another problem that you then have 72 hours to talk to the supervisory authority because that's the new breach response timelines. And document activities as you go. So document your decisions. Organizations are advised to document all activities and maintain records of decisions made, data discovery methods, processes, and timeframes. Even after the data has been produced, organizations can expect data subjects to challenge the approaches taken. So this is why it's important. If you've redacted certain information, such as intellectual property, it's important to note where those redactions have been made and what the reasoning was, in case, for example, it is challenged, that you have that defensible approach to go back to. And unless it can be robustly defended, the requester has scope to make a complaint to the supervisory authorities. So, considering the rights and freedoms of other individuals, The GDPR says you do not have to comply with a subject access request if doing so would mean disclosing information about another individual, as we discussed earlier on. So the rule in practice: make the decision now about disclosing third-party information on a case-by-case basis. You can't apply a blanket policy of withholding it. That just won't work. The best practice approach is either going to be getting consent from the other data subjects or redacting. So redacting in most cases tends to be what organizations do, because sometimes getting consent from the other data subjects can be even more difficult. So we move on to poll 5, Rob.
Thanks a lot, Sean. So, okay, and this pertains a little bit to some of what Sean was talking about a little bit earlier on, about your estimation on the cost after the 25th of May to deal with data subject access requests for the remainder of the year. So do let us know what you estimate the cost would be for you to deal with data subject access requests after GDPR has started on the 25th of May. Is it going to be less than £1,000? Is it going to be between £1,000 and 25,000? Is it going to be between 25,000 and 50,000, more than 50,000, and or whether you don't know? So here are the results. Those of you who think that it's going to cost you less than £1,000, that's 27%. Between £1,000 and £25,000, it's going to be 25%. £25,000 to £50,000, 4%. More than £50,000, 3% of you, and the vast majority of you said you can't give an estimate on the cost for this for the remainder of the year.
Okay, so once again, that's reasonably interesting set of results there, Rob. And again, the organisations where it's going to be less than 1,000, obviously I can imagine they are the organisations that probably don't necessarily see this as a huge problem, or else their processes are so well defined at this stage. So we did discuss earlier that there's some organisations that are getting hundreds of these on an annual basis, and it could be a completely automated process, which is brilliant. But the remainder, I suppose, there's obviously I suppose little risk perceived there of getting the data subject access requests.
Yeah, there are some interesting results, and just harking back to what you mentioned a few minutes ago with the two individual cases that you had, one which was, I think it was about 50,000, and then the other 30,000 pounds. Those were, I mean, very eye-opening. Yeah,
so it was 50,000 and 32,000, and that was their own internal estimates between the amount of staff that was required for those ones. But I suppose in those particular circumstances, it wasn't necessarily a customer as a data subject. It was part of an internal disciplinary. So there was obviously more information to collect there for those. So that's the other thing to probably consider as well, is whether two processes are needed for internal staff and external staff, and how you're going to manage those processes. But yeah, I mean, it can certainly be costly if there isn't a defined process there.
Sure. Okay, well, I'm going to close that poll and back over to you.
The conclusion, so realistically, it's more just about the services that BSI offer. So GDPR project management, specialist consultancy advice, implementation support, specialist software, policy and procedure development, experience dealing with supervisory authorities, etc. And some of the areas that we worked, so the utilities sector, credit unions, pension providers, legal, technology, government, retail, transport, and that was it realistically. So I suppose we can probably move on quickly to some of the Q&A if you wish.
Absolutely. Okay, so as you can imagine, we've been inundated with questions. I'm going to pick a handful of the questions that we've had come in. The first is, building a template for DSARs, what is the best approach for doing something in a defined way?
Yeah, so the handiest thing probably, and if we go back and look at the slide that we had earlier on, which was around around what you should do, so the structured approach needed by BSI, so recognize, review, verify, acknowledge, refuse, engage with the individual. plan, find and retrieve, produce the information, document your activities, balance the rights of the individual versus other individuals that are on it. So having that into sort of a workflow and kind of a project management stream can certainly help with the process. And obviously understanding where the data actually is in the first place is obviously one of the most important things there as well.
Great. We've got a question which is coming about examples or case studies of how small to medium businesses are planning to address DSARs at the minute right now.
Yeah. So, some organizations, I suppose, what they're looking at doing at the moment, and certainly if I'm advising them around the areas of data minimization and actually sticking to a data retention policy. So you'd be surprised the amount of organizations that I've gone into that they may have a data retention policy, but while it's there, it's really only words on a sheet of paper. It's not actually been responded to. I know in my previous career before BSI, where I was the head of e-discovery for a large bank, it was quite difficult at times because we used to have information going back to the early 1990s, which was all discoverable effectively, and not being able to get rid of it causes probably the biggest problem. So consolidating the information that you have obviously makes it easier, and certainly for smaller organizations, or small to medium organizations, the more consolidated that information is, or the more you narrow the scope of the information you have to search, obviously makes it much easier when actually searching, retrieving, and giving it out to the data subject.
Okay, that's great. Next question we have is, do you think there's going to be a risk because they're removing the chargeable fees from subject access requests? Do you think it's going to be abused effectively?
Absolutely. To be honest, I mentioned earlier some of the talks and stuff we'd organised this year for ISACA Ireland, where we're getting almost as many people not from industry as from industry coming out to have a look, to find out a bit more about this because they've heard of these things. I also mentioned earlier on, you'd be surprised the amount of people that a nominal fee of whether it's £10 or €6.35 would actually put them off having to follow through with a data subject access request. But because that barrier is no longer there, it's going to make it a lot easier for people, even if, we talked about the higher risk organizations, banks, insurance companies and things like that, could potentially be higher risk there. And it just removes one of those extra barriers that people may have been put off by before.
Okay, the next question is, how far back can someone ask for their information?
As far back as you hold it.
Right.
It's the easiest answer I can give there. So if you have it, so we mentioned earlier for, I think it was your second question about resource constraints, small and medium businesses, trying to reduce the amount of data that you actually hold and reduce the scope of it. I mean, if you have the data there, one of the big things about the GDPR is the process of data minimization, and that's what they want to do, is that companies aren't holding information just for the sake of holding it anymore. So as long as you have it, you're going to have to be able to produce it and give it to that individual.
That's incredible. I think my bank has my details since I was 16, so that's a very long time.
It's a long time.
In terms of the does it apply to employees in a particular business as well? I think you might have touched on this a little bit earlier on, but yeah.
Yeah. So it does. So it applies basically if you're an EU citizen. It applies to you. So it doesn't necessarily, you don't have to be a customer of a business. You can be an employee of a business. You can be a business owner yourself, submitting a subject access request to another organization, etc. So it's not tied down that it's only customers of your organization, and your employees don't really matter. Employees, in a lot of circumstances, send in the most difficult subject access requests to deal with because the company has nearly more information on them than they do about their own customers.
Okay, the next one is about general members of the public. How are they going to know that that their rights have changed after the 25th of May or come the 25th of May?
Yeah, so again, I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier, Rob, about the ISACA conferences and stuff that we've mentioned. Most people at this stage have heard at least of the GDPR. They might not necessarily know fully about the subject access requests yet, but as an example, my own parents, who would not be tech savvy, would not be into anything to do with computers, have heard of GDPR and they know what it is. So the other thing as well is that there is material that's been published out there by the various supervisory authorities for individuals about knowing your rights. I've seen ad campaigns running here in the Republic of Ireland. I've seen it was BBC Northern Ireland over the summer had a segment on it for about 20 minutes as part of the news. So it is definitely been broadcast out there. Whether or not people are going to go crazy with subject access requests probably remains to be seen. We'll know straight away, probably between the 25th of May and the 1st of June, exactly how many people do know their rights and are looking for subject access requests.
Right. I'm just going to run through only a couple more questions. So the first is in terms of, we've had a question which is coming about CCTV, because I think this is quite a big topic as well. Have you got any thoughts, or can you shed some light on how that is going to be handled under the DSAR rules?
Under the DSARs, yeah. So CCTV actually does come in under it as well, because your photographic image is technically your personal data. So if you're taking CCTV, you will be required to give copies of that where relevant to the data subject as part of the request. Now, the only thing is you need to be careful with CCTV, because especially if it's in a high volume area, you have more right to push back on it to try and get specific time periods. So a lot of the cases that I've seen where CCTV has been requested, it's because someone has injured themselves or they've fallen. In a lot of cases, the organization might not necessarily have the technical ability to give them the live footage, so they have to maybe take screen stills of a period of time, so that they can redact other individuals out of it or blur their faces, for example, before distributing that kind of information. But it's certainly definitely part of the subject process, if they can be identified from it, certainly.
Right, that's incredible, especially because you've got to find the individual in and amongst the crowd, I would imagine. Okay, the last question, and I guess this is quite an open question, is how worried should businesses be with this looming?
And no one really knows for certain if companies are going to be inundated with subject access requests on the 25th of May this year. And anyone that tells you that they do know, it's really guessing. So I personally have a feeling that, so the slide we showed earlier with the amount of complaints for subject access requests, between the annual report from the Data Protection Commissioner last year and the one that will be produced next year, I would expect a big spike in that, because I do think there is more information out there. I think more people know about it. I think the fact that the barrier of not having to pay the fee is that's going to be gone, is going to be a pro, certainly for the individual, that there's less pushback from the organization or the business side on it. So I mean, I would be surprised if we don't see an increase in them, but I could be wrong as well. But from what I've seen, probably over the last 12 to 18 months, I think more people are aware of this kind of stuff. They're more aware of their rights, and some people are kind of waiting until May. Even if you haven't noticed an increase of them now with all the extra information, the other thing to remember about the subject access requests as well is, under the current directive, you need to be able to show material damage to put in a claim against an organization for mishandling your personal information. But under the GDPR, that's actually going to be gone as well. So you could end up with a lot of people are just waiting until May the 25th to start submitting these, because they know that if they submit it at the moment, there's no retrospective penalties, for example, on the organization if they don't handle it properly. But after May, there might be. And it could potentially be a bit of an ambulance chasing situation almost, where People are actively seeking out organizations to try and make this process difficult for them, so that in order to go away, they might be offered some money. So I know a former colleague of mine submitted a subject access request to an insurance company, and he was offered €5,000 to drop it at the time. Now, I would imagine if it was a general member of the public, they may not have done that, but they probably looked at his LinkedIn profile and said, we don't want to have to deal with this, to be honest. Now, he didn't take it at the time because it was would have been probably a conflict of interest for him. But that's the kind of stuff, I suppose, that that companies would need to be worried about, I guess.
Well, that's some really, really incredible information. And thank you so much today, Sean, for all of your insight and help, and as well as that honesty in terms of explaining all of what's happening right now in the industry with regards to DSARs. Okay, so that said, thank you very much, Sean. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, as well, for joining us today. We certainly hope you've enjoyed the webinar. So I'm
Absolutely. Thanks, Rob.
Not a problem. So with that, I'm going to end the webinar now, and thanks. Bye.